Thank you guys for being here, the last session of the afternoon. I appreciate it. I'm going to be talking about driving contextual experiences in the anonymous era. And today, most of us contend with an audience that is primarily anonymous. So how do we understand who they are and engage them in ways that we really haven't been able to before? Who am I? My name is Andrew Jones. I'm an industry analyst. I was previously at VentureBeat Insight, where I helped build the new research division. Before that, I was at Altimeter Group, where I was an analyst for several years as well. And for the past 6 years or so, I've been looking at these twin topics, two sides of the same coin. Customer identity on one hand, and personalization. So understanding who our audience is, who our visitors, our users are, to the greatest extent possible so that we can personalize their experiences for them. So it's nice context for me following our previous speaker. First, just to take a moment, talk about marketing itself. Marketing has fundamentally changed, and we all in this room, we know that that's the case. It used to be really about the message-centric. We were trying to create the best message possible for our audience, and it was, for the most part, a one-size-fits-all approach. Whether it was a billboard or even our website, we basically were trying to create one good message for most of our audience. Today, it's customer-centric. Our customers, they have unprecedented access to information and to their peers thanks to search and social media and other tools. They're so empowered, and yet they're overwhelmed with messages. But at the same time, they are creating so much data about themselves, so many digital breadcrumbs. We have, as marketers, also an unprecedented opportunity, and that is to follow who they are, understand who they are. There's so much data that we can collect. And for better or worse, there are a lot of tools that help us do that. Sometimes it feels a bit overwhelming, but all that data, that rich data about our customers, can be collected today. So marketing, as a result, has become customer-centric instead of message-centric. Now, to really get to the meat of the conversation today, 97% or 98% about, on average, of our website visitors are anonymous. That means only 2 to 3% typically are providing an email address or some kind of other identifier about who they are. Let that sink in. 2 to 3% provide some kind of identifier. Really small minority. So the majority, definitely, we don't know really who they are. They're considered anonymous. And in spite of that, we typically are catering to this 2 to 3%. We're targeting this 2 to 3% with email marketing, primarily. That's when we begin our contextual marketing today. We do a certain amount of retargeting. If someone puts something in a shopping cart and abandons, we might retarget them, and that's still anonymous. But that's based on very limited data. And typically it can be effective, but it's based on a very limited interaction point, not much context, and it's also based often on third-party data as well, which we'll talk about in a moment, has some challenges. So for the most part, we're targeting this 2 to 3% when it comes to modern marketing, this contextual experience that we're trying to get to today. Now, most of you know already that this majority of your audience is anonymous, that you don't necessarily have emails for them. And so, again, for the most part, we're ignoring or doing very little in terms of engagement with most of this audience until we do get that email address. And that's when we're beginning to engage them in more relevant ways. A lot of us have moved to marketing automation, for example. Even our ESPs have added automation and segmentation capabilities. That's where we're doing those kinds of efforts. But that means we're leaving that 97% of our audience behind. And for the most part, this audience is getting so neglected that they're not necessarily coming back. So progressive profiling is a relatively new term, more common buzzword in marketing. We're basically trying to learn over time who our audience is, who our visitors are. We're building a profile as we engage time over time with our audience. Most interactions with our audience on our website are anonymous. So even for that minority that gives us an email address, there are multiple interactions before we even get that email address. But there's so much that we can learn about them before we even get that email address. there are multiple visits, if we ever get an email address, where we can learn what they click on, what they download, what they're filtering for, what they're searching for. You know, if it's an e-commerce site, what search term I'm coming in on, if I'm coming in on that little black dress term that Dan mentioned. And then am I filtering for something completely different? Am I looking for discounts, for example? Am I looking primarily at promotions? All of that behavioral data that you're getting from me, I'm still anonymous. You don't have necessarily an identifier for who I am. And so anonymous doesn't mean data poor. If you compare these two hypothetical profiles, one being on the left anonymous and the other one known, there's actually quite a lot of information that can be much more relevant, much more helpful in terms of segmentation, contextual understanding on the anonymous side. And this is, for the most part, based on behavioral data, although some of this can also be gotten based on browser details and the type of device that the user is coming in on. And you consider a profile on the right where you don't necessarily have that much to go on just because you have an email address. So known and anonymous aren't really that great terms anymore because it's this continuum that we're talking about today. And there's a whole lot of anonymous data, especially behavioral data, that's very valuable in terms of understanding who our audience is. So in short, anonymous does not mean data poor. So what's different today? Well, the ability to capture, to unify, and to utilize this data primarily from our website and from mobile, because it's the same thing in mobile, where unless we have a membership site or an app where we're requiring our users to log in, most of them, again, most of those visitors or users are anonymous. And it offers the opportunity for more contextually relevant engagement in all channels. If we can capture this data, so you don't have to be Amazon today to be able to capture this data and actually act on it. So we're going to talk about use cases in just a moment, but let's also focus on data distinctions as well. We've talked about anonymous versus known. Let's talk briefly about first-party versus third-party data as well. Third-party data is common. Most of us use it for advertising in particular. But in recent years, many marketers have become increasingly skeptical of third-party data. Right? There's a big question about the transparency of this data, the quality of this data, and between anecdotes and actual data that's come out in terms of some of the questionability of third-party data, there are concerns about whether how accurate this data is. Characteristics like gender, for example, have been shown to be wrong over a third of the time in certain tests that have been done. So it's a bit concerning. Most of this data, this third-party data, is probabilistic, and that's the challenge. Basically, it amounts to best guesses. And you don't necessarily know how that best guess was made because you don't have any transparency into that third-party data. So let's look at these comparisons. First-party known data, that's your data that you own, and it's known. It's great data quality. This is like what you're using for email segmentation and engagement because you have an email address as part of that profile. But the scale's not very good. You're not reaching very many. It's that 2 to 3% that you're reaching, not the 100% of the visitors that are coming to your website. Now, third-party anonymous data, you've got huge scale, World Wide Web data, but definite questions about the quality of that data. Then think about the first-party data, again, that you own, and then that is anonymous. So you don't necessarily have that identifier, but in this case, there's a whole lot you can learn about these people, also specific to your website, your site architecture, your site metadata, or your application, and it's very accurate. So this is kind of gives you the best of both worlds. You've got great scale and good data quality. Okay, so that's all good and well. How do we use this? How do we actually use this data, right? So two ways. One is on the anonymous side, engaging our anonymous audience, and the other is on the known side. Once we actually have an email address, this is still very valuable. So on the anonymous side, better advertising. On the website, we can do better personalization and engagement and testing. And on mobile, we can do better push notifications, better engagement there as well. And we'll talk about some of the specifics. And on the known side, we can build sooner, better profiles, and then richer profiles for the known customer records that we have. It's the same thing for whether it's email or direct mail or any other known engagement channel. So on the anonymous side, many of you recognize these strategies. Many of you use these strategies. So most of them are familiar, but today most of these are one-off activities. You have an individual vendor that you're working with to do retargeting, for example. Now, that's not bad. I mean, retargeting can be very effective, but like I mentioned before, retargeting is based on a very narrow set of data, maybe a single point of data where someone has put something into a shopping cart and then abandoned. So retargeting can be effective based on that data point, but that's a very incomplete picture of everything they've done on your website. Maybe they've browsed for other things. Maybe they've looked at other parts of your site that could be relevant. And so to ignore all of that and engage purely on one single contextual piece of data is not necessarily the best way to approach it. And the reality is that Telium actually did a study with eConsultancy. 51% of organizations are using more than 20 different digital marketing solutions. And for many of you, it's going to be a bigger number than that. I mean, part of tag management is simply managing the number of tags that are on these sites. And it's because this is a big number of tags you're contending with. So each of these individual tools right now is typically collecting data in a disparate little data silo and acting on just that one piece of data or that one sliver of data. This is the result. And most of you know this story, right? The blind man and the elephant, where the blind men go around the elephant. One pulls the tail and thinks it's a snake, and one touches the tusk and thinks it's a rhino or a spear or something, and the other one touches the leg and thinks it's a tree trunk. Well, digital marketers today, they're acting on individual pieces of data, don't have full context, and so as a result, they have very skewed ideas of who their customers are. And they're acting on that data, they're engaging their customers with that limited set of data. So the use cases: advertising, retargeting, and lookalike audiences. Retargeting, definitely many of you are familiar with, but if we can retarget based on that much richer contextual understanding of who these people are, we can, for one, we can do retargeting not only more accurately, but with a much broader audience. Because if someone has looked at a single pair of shoes 15 times, then there's a good idea that they're interested. And if they looked at a certain category maybe 20 times, then you know they're interested in that category. And so you can begin to build a profile that is much more complete than just a single point on a website. And lookalike audiences means that you can combine that data with the data that a Google or a Facebook has as well. And you can find more of those people who are already valuable to you. On the website, most of these relate to personalization in some way. Live chat, the ability to not just ask someone if they need help and engage them, but to understand where they've been on the site, to engage them about the products they've looked at. If you know they've looked at a more premium service on a B2B site, for example, selling them or talking to them foremost about that service as opposed to maybe the one that's on promotion right now. Product recommendations. If you have products, the ability to make those recommendations, again, based on a much more cohesive, complete contextual understanding of what that person has looked at, what they're interested in, what their intent to purchase is maybe. Content personalization, again, very similar. It's the idea that you can show the right content based on those experiences. And SEO, I mean, it doesn't have to be one-to-one. We're talking about segmentation. If we've segmented, if we understand the personas, the types of people that are coming, then we can create different landing pages, different individual persona contexts for those different types of visitors that are coming. And mobile, similar to website, push notifications and in-app engagement. If we know how many times they've opened our app, what kind of content they've looked at in our app, well, then we know what they're interested in, where they're interested, what they look at, possibly what they're interested in buying. So these notifications can be more relevant, again, based on that contextual understanding, which does not have to be based on a known profile, but completely anonymous. This is a cool case study. I talked to Telium recently. Cathay Pacific. They have been segmenting visitors based on the cabins that they've been browsing or have purchased. And they are running more targeted Optimizely tests as a result. So this is similar to for those of you who are in the room before, who are looking at the A/B testing and A/B personalization type topics. And they were using primarily anonymous behavioral data, although that could also be combined with loyalty data for those users, although again, small minority that are logged in. And they've seen an 11% lift based on, again, primarily anonymous browsing behavior data that is related to what cabins they're browsing. It doesn't have to be very complete or a very elaborate set of data. 11% lift. It's a pretty large number. Known use cases. So not just in terms of engaging our anonymous audience, but also the known ones, the ones where we do have an email address, the ones where maybe we're already doing segmentation and engagement in terms of our marketing automation. Well, if we can begin to create profiles sooner, then we have a profile that already exists by the time we get an email address. So these profiles can be built from the moment the visitor first reaches our website. And we can, again, through progressive profiling, we can build those profiles without necessarily needing an email address. And so we have profiles built for 100% of our visitors. And then as soon as we get an email address, we slap that on, and then they're technically a known user. Apart from the difference in terminology, it doesn't really matter whether it's an email address or not. We know more about this person already. So by the time you get a name and an email address, you have this profile. That means you don't have to have this cold start problem where many of us today only begin building user profiles once we have an email address. And then how much segmentation can you do based on that? Maybe you have one purchase that's been made or one sign up for a newsletter, you have that email address. How much segmentation can you do on that? Not very much, but if you have captured this anonymous behavioral data beforehand, you've got a lot to go on. So what are the requirements here? Better data collection sooner. So earlier collection as soon as that visitor first hits your website or opens your app. You want that to be collected and usable in real time, not after the fact. And consolidated profiles, they need to be unified, consolidated, available not just for a single tool and not just collected by a single tool, but unified and consolidated and available for every tool to use. So the question for all of you is, will you continue to neglect this majority of your website visitors? There is so much that we can know about this group, and yet most of us are simply ignoring them or doing very little in terms of engaging them with what is most relevant to them. So, quick summary, recap, marketing has changed, right? We are trying to deliver these contextual experiences today, yet we're neglecting 97% of our audience, the vast majority of our website audience, and only truly engaging, for the most part, those ones that provide some kind of identifier, like an email address. Yet there is so much data available. All of that anonymous data should be captured, can be used to understand, to segment, to engage those users. And the use cases, they span across all channels. We're not talking about just one channel. It's ads on our website, on mobile devices, email, direct mail, really any channel that you're interacting with these customers on. The data requirements we just talked about, it needs to happen sooner. You need to be collecting data immediately, as soon as they hit your website. And not just analytics data, where you might be using it to make generalizations about your audience. It needs to be about each individual, and you need to be able to act on that data, not just use it as information to find some insights about your audience. It needs to be available in real time, collected in real time and available in real time. Interest has a half-life, right? I mean, if you're interested in shopping for something, or you're interested in whether it's B2B or B2C, you're interested in something, that interest dissipates. From conversations that I've had, 75% of interest is gone within 12 hours. And it can be gone much sooner than that, especially if it's a small purchase, maybe an impulse purchase. And that data needs to be unified and centralized, because it needs to be available across the board. What good does data do you if it's in a single silo, available for a single tool? And again, you've got blind men and the elephant, where everyone is acting on a single piece of data that could be actually completely irrelevant to who that person is or what they're interested in that moment.